He's considered one of the big three Hollywood film comedians of the silent era, with an impressive array of memorable scenes, in some of which he risked his life. Yet he might be more famous today than he was in his heyday, at least in the movie world. This death-defying and seemingly indestructible man was Buster Keaton. Joseph Frank Keaton was born on October 4th, 1895 in Piqua, Kansas, a very small village in the eastern part of the state. His parents, Joe and Myra, were small-time entertainers at medicine shows, and they kind of embodied some of the negative stereotypes people had then of those in the entertainment world. Joe liked to get into fistfights, and Myra rolled her own cigarettes, and both were rather neglectful to their son. Young Joseph got his famous nickname Buster early on after another actor saw him fall down a flight of stairs and exclaimed that he was a regular Buster. Even when too young to walk, Buster would crawl onto the stage during his parents' act, much to his father's chagrin, but to the audience's delight. There are a lot of stories about young Buster's apparent indestructibility, though some of them may have been exaggerated. One is definitely true. The tip of one of his index fingers got mangled in a clothes wringer and had to be amputated. He was also said to have been hit in the head by a falling brick, and at 8 years old, his father misjudged a stage kick and knocked him unconscious for 18 hours. And most insane of all, he supposedly got thrown airborne by a tornado, but was set down safely. Buster didn't have a stable home growing up, because his parents were constantly traveling around random towns for their act and dime museum and stock company shows, which were below vaudeville in terms of prestige. But the young boy proved to be their greatest asset. After he was added to the act, its popularity quickly increased, and by 1901, Buster was a sensation on the stage. His signature act was when his father would quite literally throw him across the stage, into the backdrop, or sometimes into the orchestra pit. Once, his father even reportedly threw him at an unruly audience member. 2 years were added to Buster's age to get around child labor laws and avoid scrutiny from the Gary Society, which tried to catch illegal child labor, though they remained a constant looming presence. In fact, Joe Keaton got busted by the Gary Society in 1907 for allowing Buster's younger siblings, Harry and Louise, to perform on stage when they were well below the legal age for labor. His arrest was just a minor setback, though, and the family was making $750 a week by 1909. Around that same time, Buster got his first taste of a more permanent living situation when the family got a home in Muskegon, Michigan, where they lived in a community with other vaudeville people. Buster had his first impactful experiences with movies around 1915, when he saw and enjoyed the 1914 movie Tilly's Punctured Romance and the 1915 movie The Birth of a Nation. The newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst also approached Joe in 1914 about having the family act appear in a movie, but Joe didn't believe in movies, thinking that the vaudeville stage was more prestigious, so he declined. Joe caused problems for the act when he got blacklisted from a big vaudeville circuit after upsetting its impresario, leading to the act's inability to get booked to bigger shows. Facing this insurmountable obstacle, in 1917, Buster and Myra broke up the act by leaving Joe in San Francisco, while they headed back to Michigan. Trying to figure out the next step in his career, Buster got a gig in a stage show called The Passing Show in New York. While preparing for that, he happened to meet up with an old acquaintance there who had gotten into the movie business, and he took Buster to see a movie being filmed. The man who was filming a movie there was Roscoe Arbuckle, known by his screen nickname Fatty. Arbuckle invited Buster to do a scene with him, which he eventually agreed to, though he was at first more interested in the filming equipment. Buster's performance impressed Arbuckle enough to hire him for the company he worked for, the Comique Film Corporation, at $40 a week, though this was quickly raised to $75, then later all the way up to $250. Arbuckle also taught Buster filming techniques and how to edit film by splicing and joining. The shorts they made together were pretty much pure slapstick, but this was a great way of advancing his career, since Arbuckle was one of the biggest comedians in the world then. But then America's entry into World War I disrupted things. Arbuckle was rejected by the military due to his weight, but Buster went into the Army in July 1918. He didn't see any combat, and spent much of his time in France entertaining troops, which kept him there until March 1919. While there, he got an ear infection that severely damaged his hearing permanently, and he also took up chain smoking. And now, we finally arrive at the 1920s. Arbuckle left Comique for famous players Lasky to make features, and the last Arbuckle Keaton short, The Garage, was released in January 1920. So now, Buster was the top star at Comique, and his boss, Joseph Skank, increased his salary to $1,000 a week. If his salary is any indicator, Buster had risen very quickly in movies in less than 3 years. Keaton finished his first solo short in September 1920 called The High Sign. And some of you big Buster Keaton fans might be saying, but that wasn't his first short. Yes and no. It was the first one he made, but definitely not the first one he released. He wasn't satisfied with how it turned out, so he shelved it for the time being. He really wanted to create his own style, and he probably thought The High Sign was too similar to his shorts with Arbuckle. In October, he released his first short, a very memorable one called 1 Week. This was a comedy based around Buster and his wife's inability to construct their own kit home, which eventually spirals into the dilapidated building spinning uncontrollably before being hit by a train. Yeah, there's a lot going on there. Here, he succeeded in making something a bit different, and it contained many of the hallmarks he would become famous for, and it's probably his most well-known short. That same month, he made his feature debut in The Saphead. This movie feels off if you're familiar with Keaton's style. It's a light comedy drama, with Buster being relatively stationary and subdued for most of the movie. It only starts to feel a little familiar at the very end, when he gets tossed around the stock market floor. And here's a novelty for you. His character is limping and bleeding and looks like he's actually in pain. That's a rarity for him, but more on that as we go on. For the next couple of years, Keaton's production of shorts was steady, only disrupted by an occasional injury. The most serious of these was when he broke his ankle while filming The Electric House, which is why his short, The Playhouse, doesn't have a lot of physically demanding stunts in it. He was still recovering. And he put off The Electric House for a while. The High Sign was also finally released while he was recuperating, in order to keep product coming for his distributor, Metro Pictures. Compared to his two big contemporaries, Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd, Keaton's shorts often had a different feel to them, mostly because of his imaginative gags. Of course, there was the spinning house in 1 Week, as well as the final sequence when a train misses hitting the house only for another train to come out of nowhere and smash it. One of the most famous examples of Keaton's technical innovation was in The Playhouse, where he plays multiple characters on screen at the same time. He achieved this by using camera effects which he swore his team to secrecy for the time being, so nobody else could steal his idea. He also liked to blow up the scale of big scenes. In Cops, he takes the very old gimmick of being chased by policemen to the extreme by having a massive number of cops joining in the chase. and he repeats this in a slightly reduced scale in Daydreams. There are so many other memorable scenes from his shorts, but I'll just mention a few here and sprinkle in a few more later on. At the end of Hard Luck, everyone thinks he died after diving into a tiled floor and making a big hole. But some time passes and he returns with a Chinese wife and children. A very absurd way to end it. In Daydreams, a beaten and battered Buster gets casually delivered to his love interest's house by a mailman. And it really cracked me up in The Goat when he turns an elevator's floor indicator so that the elevator blasts out of the roof of the building. I also like this random scene in Neighbors when he runs into a cop as he's trying to escape from them, so he starts doing a jig. And not long after that, he tries out this interesting escape plan. And if you like now obscure parodies, you can check out The Frozen North, which spoofs William S. Hart movies. With a successful series of shorts, the Comique Film Corporation was renamed to Buster Keaton Productions in 1922, and his salary was raised to $2,000 a week, then $2,500 later on, plus profit sharing and bonuses. In all, Keaton released 19 solo shorts between 1920 and 1923, with a few of them now considered some of his best work. And now he was ready for the next step in his career. There was also some stuff going on in his personal life in the early 1920s as well. His parents separated in 1920, but didn't get divorced. Joe was a very difficult partner, who sometimes hit Myra, as well as his children. Buster had had some experience with women already by this point, and he'd had relationships with actresses Alice Lake and Viola Dana. But then he got engaged in February 1921 to Natalie Talmadge. Natalie was the sister of the famous movie stars Norma and Constance Talmadge, but she herself had not been able to make it in the movies, though she did some behind-the-scenes work. They got married a few months later on May 31st, 1921. Their son Joseph was born in 1922, with another son, Robert, born in 1924. Neither of them was madly in love with the other or anything, and Keaton may have been considering the value of being added to the illustrious Talmadge family. Not only was there Constance and Norma, but his boss, the movie executive Joseph Skank, was married to Norma. Unfortunately for Keaton, Natalie's intimidating mother didn't like him very much. But the most distressing thing to Keaton at this time was the Roscoe Arbuckle situation. In September 1921, he got caught up in the biggest Hollywood scandal of the decade. An actress had died during Arbuckle's raucous party in a San Francisco hotel, and he was accused of her murder. The trial was a huge and very consequential event, with the saga finally concluding in April 1922. Although he was eventually acquitted, Arbuckle's career was finished. He was essentially blacklisted, his films were pulled from circulation, and he was a broken man. Arbuckle had actually invited Buster and Natalie to the ill-fated party, but Buster had declined because Natalie didn't like rowdy parties, and they had gone yachting instead. Buster never wavered in his support of Arbuckle's innocence, and tried to help him. He hired him when no one else wanted anything to do with him. But Arbuckle was a changed man, now prone to angry, drunken outbursts, so Keaton had to let him go. By 1923, shorts were considered low prestige. Features were the new thing. I mean, they'd been around for a while, but by now they were becoming the main thing people came to movie theaters to see. As we've seen, Keaton had already been in a feature, but now he and his team were in charge, and they were given the green light by Joe Skank and the shareholders to proceed. I don't want to just go through the plot of each movie, so I'll go through each of them and say one or two interesting things about each one, just little facts or tidbits. Keaton's first solo feature was 3 Ages, which was really a perfect way to transition from shorts to features. It's divided up into 3 sections, and if the segments of each period are put together, each would be about the length of a 2-reel short. This format was taken from D.W. Griffith's 1916 film Intolerance, which took place in different time periods as well. In 3 ages, there's a caveman section, an ancient Roman section, and a modern section. Overall, it did pretty well with the public, certainly enough to continue doing features. His next was definitely a step up, though. Our Hospitality was Keaton's biggest triumph up to that point, featuring a lot of his hallmarks, including a dangerous stunt on a waterfall, trains, and of course, clever gags. In one of his most dangerous stunts, during the on-location filming of the waterfall rescue scene, a wire holding Keaton snapped, causing him to freefall into the Truckee River. When he was found 10 minutes later, he was face down in the mud along the riverbank. Obviously, he survived, but he very well could have died that day. The scene was later reshot in a studio. Another serious injury happened during filming of his very next movie, Sherlock Jr. In one scene, he got shot out of a waterspout with high-pressure water, then hit his head on a railroad track below, causing him to black out, and he had extremely painful headaches for the next few weeks. Sherlock Jr. also contains some of Buster's most innovative technical feats. He used a double exposure in one scene to appear like he was exiting his own body. He wasn't the first to do this, but it was still pretty uncommon then. Then, in a very entertaining sequence, he jumps into a movie and has to cope with the changing scenery all around him. To do this with simple cuts, Keaton had to use surveying equipment to make sure he was in the exact same pose when the next cut happened, to keep the illusion of continuity. In a couple of impressive gags when running away from criminals, he jumps out of a window into an old woman costume, then he seemingly jumps through a person's stomach and disappears. Suffice it to say, Sherlock Jr. is one of Buster's most inventive movies. But it wasn't a great success. In fact, preview showings of the movie didn't go well, so Keaton kept making cuts until it was only about 44 minutes long, which wouldn't even count as a feature for many exhibitors. Audiences were impressed by the stunts, but didn't find the movie actually funny, and thought it was a step down for Keaton. His next movie, The Navigator, fared better, and that might be because he had more explicitly comedy gags in it. It also shows off another of Keaton's loves, boats. Keaton convinced Joe Skank to pay $25,000 for a boat that was about to be scrapped, and then centered the movie around it. This boat, the Buford, had been a transport ship in the Spanish-American War and World War I, and had also been used to deport people during the first Red Scare. After some issues trying to film the underwater scenes in a swimming pool, the team went to Lake Tahoe instead. The problem was that it was really cold there. The cameramen filmed in a diving bell, and both they and Keaton could only go under for about 15 minutes at a time because of the temperature. That's probably why, unlike Buster's usual penchant for doing long takes of stunts, there's a lot more cuts in these scenes. Each time Keaton and the crew came back up, they drank bourbon to help keep them warm. The Navigator is one of the movies that experienced a big revival decades later, and because of that, it's still one of his better-known ones. Seven Chances was a movie that Keaton didn't want to do. Joe Skank pretty much just thrust the story on him and told him to turn it into a movie. He owed Skank money, so he had to accept it. It was based on a stage play that Keaton thought was silly. But he had his own way of protesting. He filmed the play's story in shortened form, then devoted a large portion of the movie to a long chase, with Buster being pursued by desperate wannabe brides for the remaining 40% of the runtime. At previews, people didn't laugh for much of the first half, and an especially big laugh came when it wasn't supposed to. Investigating this, Keaton and his team found that, as he ran down a hill, he had kicked up some rocks that began chasing him. Because this seemed to get a good reaction, he was inspired to add in the now famous scene where big fake rocks roll after him as he runs away. Despite not being a passion project at all, the movie still grossed quite a bit more than Sherlock Jr. In Go West, Buster's leading lady isn't a lady at all, but a cow. It's interesting because when animals co-starred in movies then, it was usually a horse or a dog or a monkey, so using a cow was thinking a bit outside the box. The fact that the cow, Brown Eyes, was the leading lady is made clear at the end, when the rancher tells Buster he can have anything he wants after saving his cattle drive. Buster says he wants her and points to the side. The rancher's daughter thinks he means her, but then he goes and grabs Brown Eyes instead. Overall, Keaton was pretty ambivalent about Go West. Battling Butler, however, was a movie that Keaton himself liked a lot, but it's considered one of his weakest 1920s movies. For much of the movie, he doesn't move around very much, which kind of reminds me of The Saphead or the first half of Seven Chances. Although you do get to see his character at his angriest in the climactic scene. And while filming Battling Butler, he fell out of the practice boxing ring and hit his head, and also tore some ligaments in his legs and back. And here we come to his most famous work of all. The General was basically Buster's dream movie. He loved trains, which often appeared in his other movies, but The General would be almost exclusively about them. It was based on a memoir called The Great Locomotive Chase, which was about a real event during the Civil War, which was, you guessed it, a train chase. Buster went all out for this one, filming on location at Cottage Grove, Oregon, hiring 1,500 locals, and making the single most expensive take in the history of silent film when he sent a train over a collapsing bridge into a river below. That one take cost $42,000. And fun fact, the train actually stayed in the river for about 15 years until it was scrapped. The cost of production was very high, reaching about $750,000 when Keaton's movies never grossed that much. This caused some friction between Keaton and Skank, but Buster got his way. He even did a lot of editing for the movie himself at his house. So after Buster put all this energy, passion, and money into The General, it must have done pretty well at the box office, right? Well, no. It flopped and actually lost money. The reason is pretty simple. It wasn't as comedy-focused as his movies usually were. It's more thrilling than funny, but when audiences went to a Buster Keaton movie, they were expecting to laugh, and The General just didn't do that for them. Harold Lloyd did a similar thing with The Kid Brother in 1927, which had much more spaced-out gags. But that movie did very well. And that might be because it had a lot of pathos that was appealing to audiences. This was also something that Chaplin was renowned for. The General has some pathos, but that's not something Keaton really focused on in any of his movies. It's more of a masterpiece of filmmaking, but people in the 1920s often had a different idea of what that meant than we do today. Keaton was dismayed at the lackluster reception of his masterpiece, but he trudged on. In his next movie, College, one interesting fact is that he actually used a stunt double for a pole vaulting stunt. Keaton pretty much always did his own stunts, which is why he got injured so many times, and I couldn't find any other instance of him using a double. This might have been due to a lack of motivation. He didn't know how to pole vault, but he had usually been willing to train at something beforehand in order to perform a certain stunt. And he had previously done a semi-pole vaulting stunt in 3 Ages, so I'd guess that he just wasn't feeling up to it as opposed to not being able to learn how to do it. Oh, and fun fact, the stuntman he used in College was Olympic pole vaulter Lee Barnes. It's funny seeing Keaton play baseball badly because in real life, he was actually really good at it and would play with other movie people in between filming sessions. But it's kind of hard to take his character as a weakling when he has that lean, muscular build, which becomes very obvious when he puts on track and field clothes. College also has a now infamous and offensive scene where Keaton puts on blackface in order to work at a restaurant, and the real black people apparently can't tell the difference. And there's also a random Easter egg in the movie. A small boat is briefly shown named Damfino, which was also the name of his boat in the short The Boat. His next movie is one of his more famous ones, Steamboat Bill Jr. You might recognize it for this famous scene, where the side of a building falls on him, and he's only saved because he's standing right where there's a hole for a window. He actually does this kind of stunt a second time shortly afterward, but it was less risky than the first. And he had previously done something similar in 1 week. And if you've seen The Covered Wagon, you might recognize Ernest Torrance as Keaton's co-star. As was common with many of Buster's now most famous movies, Steamboat Bill Jr. wasn't successful, and was a box office flop. Buster Keaton's life was about to change forever. But before we get into that, let's zoom out a bit and discuss trends and themes in his movies. Much more so than Chaplin and even Lloyd, Keaton's movies were much less plot-driven and much more gag-driven. A thin plot usually just set up scenes for a series of gags. And because of that, let's take a look at some of the themes with Keaton's gags and stunts. First off, he loved machinery. He used cars a lot, especially in chases, but that's not very unique to him. Lloyd also did a lot of similar things with cars. Keaton also used boats quite a bit, most notably in The Boat and The Navigator, where everything was built around one, as well as Steamboat Bill Jr., which heavily featured a boat. But like I mentioned before, Keaton especially loved trains, something that went back to his childhood. They pop up all the time in his movies, like at the end of 1 week when a train smashes the house, his dash through a train, and the famous shot of him sitting on the front of a train as it goes up to the camera in The Goat, the infamous waterspout stunt in Sherlock Jr. when he's running on the top of a train, a series of shenanigans on a primitive train in Our Hospitality, and of course, pretty much all of The General. Keaton also liked to play with scale. He does this most notably in the mass of policemen chasing him in Cops, the swarm of prospective brides chasing him in 7 Chances, and the cattle drive through the city in Go West. Keaton also liked to subvert expectations of common tropes. For example, in The High Sign, a bad guy throws a banana peel on the ground so Buster will slip on it, but he just walks over it. In Sherlock Jr., Buster reverses this and tries to get the bad guy to slip on a banana peel, but he stops just short, so Buster gets up and slips on it himself. And related to that, he also played with his own tropes. Like in Go West, a cowboy draws a gun on him and tells him to smile. But his screen persona can't allow him to express much else other than surprise, confusion, and most commonly, a blank expression. So he tries to form a smile using 2 fingers. He also did some gags related to his hat. He was very aware that he, Chaplin, and Lloyd all had their distinctive style of hat for their characters. In Our Hospitality, a top hat proves impractical for the train ride with all of the bouncing up and down, so Buster gets fed up and switches it out for his characteristic pork pie hat, which he apparently has in a bag. Then in Steamboat Bill Jr., his father is trying to find a hat that would suit him. They go through a bunch, but the father keeps rejecting them. But when handed a pork pie hat, Buster quickly rejects it. It's funnier when you realize that he hadn't worn his signature hat in his last few movies, and had worn a bunch of other kinds of hats instead. If you ever watch Buster Keaton movies and compare them with those of his contemporaries, you'll notice that he often had an offbeat sense of humor. For this reason, he actually earned the appreciation of surrealists like Salvador Dali and Louise Buñuel, and it's not hard to see why. Like in 3 Ages, he gives a fake lion a manicure, and then they shake hands. And facing a dog that will no longer run, he brings it to a back compartment of his chariot, where another dog is kept in storage, and changes it out like a flat tire. Or take the funky shape of his house in 1 week, which looks very similar to a German expressionist style, but doesn't represent distorted reality or emotion or anything. Then there's the imaginative dream sequence in Sherlock Jr., when he's put through a series of changing environments. Or the weirdness of seeing Buster playing multiple characters on screen in the playhouse. Or the random detail in that same short when he pulls out a wallet that opens up like a little accordion. Then in college, he leans impossibly far to his left and right while giving a speech, for no real reason other than to look bizarre and be funny. Not to mention the scene in The Navigator where he sword fights with a swordfish using another swordfish underwater, and also uses a lobster as a wire cutter. Keaton wasn't a surrealist, and probably wasn't very conscious of that movement, but its attachment to him, more so than other comedians, demonstrates that he often displayed certain bizarre and sometimes dreamlike characteristics in his movies that were quite different. Around the time that Steamboat Bill Jr. was released, the entire movie industry was in crisis mode because sound film had really caught on, and more part talkies were starting to come out. I feel like a broken record talking about the talkie revolution so much, but it just comes up over and over, so I have to keep mentioning it. Because it was so expensive for studios to convert to sound, only the bigger ones could properly get through it at the beginning. Independent producers were often not so lucky, and that's where Buster Keaton was in 1928. He was especially vulnerable because, while it may be hard to believe now, he was not a huge box office draw then. For example, let's compare the grosses between Keaton, Charlie Chaplin, and Harold Lloyd. They all released a movie in 1925. Chaplin's The Gold Rush grossed $4 million. Lloyd's The Freshman grossed $2.6 million. But Keaton's 7 Chances and Go West combined only grossed less than $1.2 million. Lloyd released one of his weaker movies in 1926, For Heaven's Sake, which still grossed $2.5 million. But Keaton's Battling Butler grossed only about $750,000, and that was on his higher end. Then there was the fact that Keaton wasn't good with his money like Lloyd. He and Natalie had expensive habits, even though he wasn't making as much as a number of other movie stars. And speaking of him and Natalie, their marriage was far from ideal. Natalie, like the other Talmadge women, was very high maintenance and also very uppity. Buster felt that she looked down on him despite his status as a movie star. He was a very prideful person, so this didn't really work out very well. She also kept wanting to move to new houses because she would get tired of the old ones very quickly, and she bought a huge amount of expensive clothes all the time. Keaton, though, was not innocent. He splurged on boats, cars, and expensive liquor. He also had a lot of extramarital affairs. Natalie was very aware of this and moved him into a guest bedroom and left it at that. And with his marriage on the rocks, his career was entering a new, ill-fated stage. Even before Buster was done filming Steamboat Bill Jr., Joe Skank told him he was dissolving his production studio. In this precarious situation, Keaton signed a contract with MGM, which is what Skank had been pushing him to do. He later said that this was probably the worst mistake of his life. He had released his last few movies through United Artists, which allowed him a bit more freedom because UA was founded on artistic freedom for its independent producers. But now MGM would call the shots. On paper, it looked like a pretty good deal because his pay was increased to $3,000 a week. But what Buster didn't quite realize was that he could not handle being part of the studio system. This system had been developed throughout the course of the 1920s, and now it had reached new levels, with MGM being one of the leaders. It cranked out movies, often with a lot of polish, but producers had supplanted directors and actors in authority and took away a lot of their autonomy and creative freedom for the sake of efficiency. The studio system created a lot of high-quality classic movies, but it generally prioritized chasing numbers, both budgets and box office grosses. Buster had been able to do what he wanted mostly, with Skank sometimes wanting him to cut back on spending, but he had been relatively free. His first movie for MGM, The Cameraman, was classic Buster, almost as if nothing had changed. And it had some memorable moments, like Buster trying and failing to smash his piggy bank. I also liked this one scene when Buster the amateur cameraman shows the newsreel boss his footage, which just consists of a bunch of unintentional special effects. There's also a bit more pathos in this movie, perhaps because that was the trend that was going on around that time for comedians. Though it's still only a little bit of it. The Cameraman did pretty well relative to Keaton's usual box office performance. But even though MGM liked the movie, it started to intrude more and more, taking away Keaton's trusted team to put them on other separate projects, not caring much about how well they worked together with him. He quickly lost authority over his movies, being told more or less what to do rather than the other way around. This damaged the creativity of his movies and also greatly demoralized him. While Keaton got along pretty well with Irving Thalberg, MGM's powerful producer, Thalberg was also one of the main forces behind the factory-like studio system, and he was confident that this way was best, no matter what Keaton wanted. And the other bigwig at MGM, Louis B. Mayer, didn't like Buster. Keaton considered himself an artist, or at the very least, a fine craftsman. And he had an artistic temperament with a very independent mind, things that did not gel well at MGM unless you were a top star. Despite what you might think, Keaton actually wanted to pursue sound, though it's uncertain if he was thinking about how that would influence his comedy style. He was fascinated with all kinds of new technology, which helped to contribute to the technical innovations in some of his movies. But MGM was fairly slow to adopt sound, and Keaton's last movie of the 1920s, Spite Marriage, was not a talkie. It's not bad, but it only partly feels like a Buster Keaton movie. We get to see him on a boat again, and there are some pretty good gags, like when he's causing all sorts of problems on stage during a play and all the stuff going down on the boat. But it just seems like that special something is missing. And that's probably at least partly due to MGM trying to reel in his production costs and limiting what he could do. So, when people talk about Buster Keaton's golden age, Spite Marriage is often not included, drawing a clear dividing line when doing a retrospective on his career. While Spite Marriage wasn't a big hit or anything, Keaton's team remained broken up, and the mediocre box office performance probably discouraged the studio from investing more in his movies. For Spite Marriage, there was a silent version and a version with a synchronized soundtrack, but Keaton would have to wait a bit longer to do an actual talkie. Ironically, given his desire to get into sound, he did have a cameo appearance in a big hit talkie, The Hollywood Review of 1929, but he didn't speak. Keaton's career went south quickly after 1929. He stayed with MGM for a few more years, often getting paired up with Jimmy Durante. Despite being somewhat obscure today, some of these MGM talkies were more profitable than his best work in the 1920s, though none were big smash hits. Even if Keaton had gone into talkies with his creative freedom intact, it still probably would have been a very difficult transition. Due to the nature of talkies, they were much more heavily scripted than silents, and the often improvised and loose style of making a comedy used by most silent film comedians was now a thing of the past. By this time, Keaton had started drinking more heavily and was a bit of a prankster pest at the MGM lot. He blatantly didn't even try to incorporate himself into the MGM system, often missing filming sessions and causing trouble, which eventually boiled over with Mayer, who fired him. In 1932, Natalie divorced him. Despondent, he said she could take whatever she wanted, so she took 90% of their shared possessions, their house and yacht, and their sons. Keaton married again in 1933 to a nurse who had helped him through his alcoholism, which he hadn't completely beaten yet. That marriage didn't end well either after she caught him having an affair, and only lasted 3 years. A few years later, he married his third and final wife, and even though she was much younger than him, it seemed to work out pretty well, and the marriage lasted for the rest of his life. His career continued to freefall, and he did a number of rather forgettable shorts for Educational Pictures and Columbia Pictures in the 1930s and early 1940s. As with many other forgotten silent film stars of yesteryear, the 1940s were the doldrums, and this was a low point for Keaton's screen appearances, though he did work as a gag consultant for MGM. Silent movies seemed far more dated than only 15 or 20 years ago, and were hopelessly old-fashioned to audiences who wanted nothing to do with them. Fortunately, salvation would come to Buster through television, another piece of new technology that he was fascinated by. He even got a couple of his own TV shows in the early 1950s, and even though those didn't last long, he made tons of appearances on other shows. Then came a wave of newfound silent film appreciation starting around the late 1950s, which gradually elevated Keaton again. He didn't seem all that interested in being recognized for what he did many years ago, but he was fairly cooperative. But he was never comfortable with fans fawning over him, and only very reluctantly accepted praise from a new generation of fans. A few times, he was tricked into confronting adoring audiences. For this generation of silent film revivalists, 2 of Keaton's movies were held up as his greatest works, The Navigator and The General, the latter of which was given pretty big showings. A rather sketchy and controversial man named Raymond Rohauer developed a rapport with the aging Keaton and was actually able to find all of his 1920s features and save them from destruction. Additionally, the actor James Mason, who was living in Keaton's old house by the mid-1950s, found copies of some of Keaton's movies in his old cutting room, and Mason, being a fan of Keaton, donated them to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for posterity's sake. A biopic about Keaton's life was released in 1957 called The Buster Keaton Story, but it's laughably inaccurate and wasn't successful. Keaton and his wife didn't like it at all, but at least he got $50,000 for the story rights. He published a memoir in 1960 and continued to appear in a lot of TV shows, commercials, and some mainstream and non-mainstream films. Suffering from a bad cough in the last years of his life, he died on February 1st, 1966 from lung cancer after decades of chain smoking. More than almost any other 1920s actor, aside from maybe Louise Brooks, Buster Keaton's status in the film world is much higher than it was when he was at his height. Incredibly, he hadn't been seen as being in the same league as Harold Lloyd and Charlie Chaplin at the time, evidenced most obviously by the huge disparity in his box office grosses compared to theirs. But now he's a movie legend, a master of the gag, and a daring filmmaker. Unlike a lot of other 1920s actors, he lived just long enough to see his reputation recover and his movies enjoyed by a new generation, many of whom hadn't even been alive yet in the 1920s. And the fact that he's still pretty well known for the movies he made a century ago is a testament to the magic that was Buster Keaton. I really hope you enjoyed this video. My original one on Buster Keaton was one of my first documentaries, back when I had no idea what I was doing and wasn't nearly as informed as I am now. I think his short Neighbors was like the second or third silent movie I'd ever seen, so that was an important step which eventually led to this channel. But what are your favorite Buster Keaton movies? Let me know in the comments. But anyway, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.